Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeff Kedman with American Purpose. We try to keep everybody on time. We have a half a dozen or so colleagues still to join. They'll be with us in 3, 4, 5 minutes. Thank you, Michelle High, Senior Editor at American Purpose. John Avlon, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you.
I,
Good
I
to be
think
on.
you, thank you. I think you all know John from the many hats that he has worn and wears. He's a journalist, he's a book author, he's a media executive, he's a former editor in chief of Daily Beast. He's a CNN anchor. And for purposes of this conversation, he is the author of a terrific book on Lincoln and cited in Schuster 2022. It's called Lincoln, pardon me, Lincoln and the Fight for Peace. I have the Kindle version on my iPad. Does someone have, John, may I impose, does someone have a copy of the book they can hold up in the screen? I'm afraid I can't do it with my iPad.
There we are.
There we go. That works. Thank you. It's really a very interesting and very valuable read because of its research, because of the framing that you do in the book, John, and because you're a fine storyteller, by the way.
Thank
And it's very compelling the way it's written. We're going to start by me asking a couple questions just to get the conversation rolling. But very quickly, we move it, open it up to the gallery. We have a hard stop, 12:45 Eastern. So, John, the first question, softball, but it must be pitched out there. So many books and so much research on Abraham Lincoln and this important president and period, but you tackle it. Why this? Why now?
You're right. It is an inevitable question, and I try to answer this in the introduction of the book as well. To your point, I was kind of stunned to realize there had been 16,000 books published about Lincoln. I mean, second only to Jesus, apparently. And I called around a bunch of Lincoln experts before I tackled this project, and I thought of it as a continuation of the broader story I began telling in Washington's Farewell, which was my previous book about Washington's farewell address, but his, warning to future generations about the forces that could destroy our democratic republic. And here, fast forward 80 odd years later, is Lincoln, uh, a very different kind of man, very similar philosophy in terms of always focusing on the national interest, um, uh, focusing on how to be a uniter in divided times. But I had this idea about how you win a peace. It's a topic I was preoccupied with, and I remember talking to the proprietor of the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago, which if y'all haven't been to, I recommend. It's kind of fun. It was created by Carl Sandburg, and it's in Chicago, and it's 3 rooms just of books about Lincoln and the Civil War. And so I asked him, and he looked around and he said, "Well, I'll be darned. I don't think anyone's done Lincoln the Peacemaker." And the logical reason for that is that he's assassinated 5 days after Appomattox, so he doesn't have a chance to implement his vision. But what I tried to do in the book is connect all his statements, written statements, conversations, letters, um, focusing on the last 6 weeks of his life, beginning with the second inaugural address, that really flesh out the fact that he had a very clear vision for how to win the peace after winning the war, which he understood, and this was his essential insight, that in a civil war, you can't simply pound your opponents into submission. If you don't win the peace, you don't really win the war. And then in a hopefully somewhat subtle way, I talk about actually the levels of power and that he intended to pull, and the larger process he put in place, and then trace the afterlife of that idea through the presidencies of Andrew Johnson when it was squandered, to Ulysses S. Grant, who got us back on the Lincoln path, and then how the idea was applied to international affairs most effectively after the Second World War, where the official policy of the country was unconditional surrender, followed by a magnanimous peace, which was Lincoln's prescription. And that, of course, made all the difference until very recent history.
So, John, thank you for that. If I were pressed to summarize the book in 3 bullet points, I would have said Lincoln's last weeks in office. I would say the rights of newly liberated African Americans. And I would say, and you've just alluded to this, leadership. Now, what an important word and what an overused word, and every business school in the country has classes in
Yeah.
leadership. Um, so easily said and so difficult to do. In winning the war, but endeavoring to win a peace, what are, from your research and looking at the correspondence and so forth, um, takeaways that made him so unique in character and judgment, and dare I even say wisdom, to do what he did and how he did it?
Well, I think it's rooted in the word you just used, character. I think the study of history comes down to a question of character, and I think the American presidency itself, character is the single indispensable quality. Um, you know, when Lincoln assumed the office, I think it's important for us to remember, but a bit difficult, how unlikely he was, how it seemed that he was destined to failure. Here he is, a man with a single term in Congress under his belt more than a decade before, representing an upstart third party in effect, the Republican Party. He'd never held executive office, never been a governor, never been a mayor, never run a business, never even served in the Senate. And he had no military experience at a time when the nation seemed on the precipice of civil war. Um, as he joked, the bloodiest combat experience he saw was as a captain in the Black Hawk War. He said he'd had a bunch of fights with mosquitoes. So this is a guy who is totally unlikely. He's from the West. He's not well known. He's had one unsuccessful run for Senate that made him famous. He's seen as more moderate and more honest than a lot of the other more radical leaders of the upstart Republican Party. But it's a bit of a fluke. It's a four-way race. He wins with less than 40% of the vote. So what I think accounts for his extraordinary growth and for his leadership, part of my book is a study in leadership. That's one of the things that interests me. I try not to club people about the head and neck with these sort of questions, but that's the subtext of the story because that's what makes success occur. And I think we very often forget how much a person's politics or their policies are rooted in something as simple as their personality, which itself is a refraction of character. And I think that what distills Lincoln's personality, I think, can be distilled to four core qualities, I argue: empathy, honesty, humor, and humility. They really do flow. I mean, he's defined by an absence of malice. He's a man, I should say, of moderate temperament, and that also impacts his politics. But those four qualities, I think, are worth dwelling upon and how they float. They rise to drive his political judgment and his leadership style. And the leadership style has been detailed or labeled, I think, imperfectly as a reconciling leader. It's a specific style of leadership focused on reconciliation. And in some of the scholarship, and I'll pull it up for this crew because we're all kind of fellow travelers in terms of defending democracy and confronting the feedback loop of extremes. This is a term that academics have put together with an eye towards psychology, but they really do describe him quite well. It is a reconciliation-oriented leadership reflects the ability to control desires for vengeance and retaliation against enemies, optimistic assessments for others' capacity of change, non-judgmental, non-dogmatic, and practical approaches to conflict resolution. Again, that's sort of the academic description, but rooting it a little bit more in day-to-day conversation. I mean, empathy defines him, and it's extraordinary that he's able to exercise it in the middle of a civil war. He says many times, I'm not anti-South, I'm not anti-Southern, I'm anti-slavery. And then crucially, they are just what we would be if we were in their position. He draws on and uses moral imagination as an incredibly important tool. It's one of the ways he, I think, undermines the arguments that had entrenched slavery. He says, I know of no good thing that a man would not want for himself. And in private, I love little details like this, in private and in public. And this is a time where people threw a lot of rhetorical red meat. He would say things like, he would call Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, Jeffy D. and Bobby Lee. And I kind of love that because it's dismissive, but it's familiar. And I think from a presidential leadership standpoint, where people appropriately watch what you say and do, it sends the message that this is a familial fight. So the fact that he's able to hold on to his empathy and to lead with that credibility from the Oval Office, even in the middle of Civil War, I think is a cautionary tale to us at a time when I think we're honest with ourselves, empathy has been strained. That's one of the extraordinary aspects of his leadership. He really does meet hate with love. He's honest. That's not simply a retrospective, you know, he's been the martyred president. And now we'll call him Honest Abe. That was his nickname during his lifetime. And indeed, I found interviews with Jefferson Davis long after the war, but contemporary political rivals who all acknowledge that he's honest. And that really gives him a reservoir of credibility to draw upon, even in negotiations with Confederates. Humor, I think, is the most defining aspect of his personality that we miss today, because he seems so somber and solemn and with a spiritual dimension, to be sure. And I think the New York Times review of my book, the reviewer seized on the word, my description of him as a soulful centrist, which I stand behind 100%, but I use once in the book, but somehow is stuck, disproportionate to how I use it. But he really is known in his lifetime as a storyteller, as a joke teller, to the annoyance of some of his contemporaries. It seems insufficient to the moment. It seems not befitting the office. But what's interesting is how he uses stories and humor strategically to communicate exteriorly and then to salve himself. He says many times, he says, look, take the common people as they run. They'll respond more quickly to a story than to a long-winded, lawyerly argument about policy. It saves him time. He's able to deliver bad news with stories. He's able to communicate on the stump more with stories. It sticks. Humor sticks. And I think it's an incredibly underutilized tool right now, particularly because, Lincoln usually use self-deprecating humor. He makes himself the butt of his own jokes. Someone calls him Two-Face, and he says, "Do you really think if I had two faces, I'd be wearing this one?" Incidentally, that's one weird, funny thing I found, is the shocking number of letters where people write home meeting Lincoln for the first time. And the shocking number of them, they describe him as the ugliest man they've ever met, which is kind of extraordinary. But he uses humor enormously effectively, but he is criticized. He's reading books of his favorite humorists out loud before signing the Emancipation Proclamation. In one case, after a really brutal Union loss in 1862, which was the worst year of his presidency, one of the worst years in American history. His friend Isaac N. Arnold, a congressman, comes up to visit him in the White House. And he goes upstairs and sees the president by the fireplace reading a book of his favorite humorist, Artemus Ward, and he's laughing. And Isaac N. Arnold is furious with Lincoln. He says, "How can you laugh at a time like this?" And in Arnold's memoirs, he recounts that Lincoln threw down the pamphlet and looked up to him with his eyes brimming with tears and said, "Don't you realize that if I could not find a way to laugh, my heart would break and I couldn't do this job?" And so humor also, I think, is a form of self-medication for him. But it's an enormously effective tool of communication and leadership for depolarizing. And finally, humility, by which I don't mean a absence of ambition. He's enormously ambitious. But he has a moral humility. He has a Midwestern modesty that's a matter of manners, but he has a moral humility. And I think that's essential too. It's informed by faith, which grows over the course of his presidency, particularly after the death of his son, Willie. One of the details I love, but I find perplexing, is he was seen repeatedly reading the book of Job for comfort and would emerge from these sessions oddly cheerful. I kind of love that detail. But he has moral humility. And I think this is one of the key lessons for us as well, broadly speaking, in the center. The second inaugural has a really good example of it. He absolutely trashes the idea that the war is about anything other than slavery, right? Which people were peddling at that time too. It's about constitutional liberty. It's about economics, states' rights. He says, no, it's about slavery. But while he demolishes any notion of moral equivalence, he also is very careful to not allow the North, who's the audience he's immediately speaking to feel any sense of moral superiority. Because he says, look, we bought the cotton, we bought the rice, we were part of the corrupt bargain that created this as a necessary condition, many felt, and through the creation of the Constitutional Convention. So we're complicit too. And now we're dealing with God's punishment for the original sin of slavery. And we all have to deal with it. And I think that's what, if I were to distill his style of centrist leadership, I think also, again, saying he's a man of moderate temperament and that influences his politics in an important way. I think it's that he combines moderation with moral courage. And that combination, I think, is the sweet spot that we don't see enough in our politics and from our political leaders. That balance of moral courage without sliding into a sense of moral superiority that allows other people to listen, which using humor helps. Humor, logic, and scripture. But I think, and ultimately, as I distill in the book, I think it's refracted into what can be called the politics of the golden rule. I think Lincoln is very consistent and thoughtful about treating other people as he'd like to be treated. And that is such a simple idea that it's easy to dismiss, but I think it's profound, and I think it's one of the primary things we're missing in our politics today.
John, thank you. I'm going to ask one more, and then we're going to open it up to the colleagues in the gallery. I permit myself to mention that yesterday I was here in Washington, D.C. in an Uber. We were driving by the Hilton on Connecticut Avenue where Ronald Reagan was shot.
Sure.
And both the driver, we both remembered how when Ronald Reagan was taken to George Washington University Hospital and was just about to go under in surgery, he reportedly said to the masked surgeons and team, "Please tell me you're all Republicans." We've lost that in lots of different ways. John, we have a friend and colleague who joins us frequently, couldn't be here today, named Steve Trachtenberg, actually the former president of George Washington University. Steve has written 2 books on leadership about university presidents. The first book, Why They Succeed, and the second book, Case Studies and Why They Fail.
Oh, I love it.
You have a little bit of this in your Lincoln book. Could you tell us a little bit about Lincoln's vice president after Lincoln's assassination? Who was he? What happened and what was revealed in his case study in leadership?
Sure. I describe Lincoln in the book as a reconciler in a time of radicals and reactionaries. And indeed, in the study of the 1850s, which is particularly worthwhile to do now, and I recommend Joanne Freeman's book, Field of Blood, and many others on the subject, you really can see the way that the feedback loop between radicals and reactionaries divide the country further. And I address it in sketches in the introduction, one of which was excerpted by Vanity Fair, where you look at the way that the secessionists demonized even Lincoln, who was running as a reconciler. And there's, for our purposes, and I say this as a group of, broadly speaking, people who are committed to defending liberal democracy, definitionally, there's a fascinating Currier and Ives print that is a great example of early negative partisanship, where the nascent Republican Party is being basically tagged as a collection of radical special interests that are enormously resonant, like ripped out of the headlines for today. But I mention that in the context of Andrew Johnson, because where Lincoln is an instinctive reconciler, Johnson is the anti-Lincoln in many respects, importantly rooted in his personality, but because he lurches alternately between radicalism and being a reactionary. It's kind of the worst possible combination from a temperament and leadership standpoint. Now, why Lincoln picks him makes a lot of sense. And in fact, it's pretty inspired in the context of the 1864 election, where Lincoln runs under the banner of the National Union Party. The Republican Party essentially rebrands, and it says, look, it does the equivalent of a Churchillian wartime, unity government, right? And in that context, Lincoln no longer has to balance, his ticket with East-West, which is Hannibal Hamlin from Maine, who'd served as his vice president in the first term. But he wants to go north-south, and Andrew Johnson makes a ton of sense. He's the only senator who doesn't secede with his state from the South. That's a very big deal. That's a legitimate portrait in courage. Lincoln, importantly, has known him from his one term in Congress, and Lincoln, as is often the case with men, I think, who or people who ascend to higher and higher levels of their profession, there's a particular comfort in people you've known for a long time. There's an easy familiarity, and Lincoln really leaned into that. He got a lot of comfort from old friends. And so the fact he'd known Johnson for a long time helped. And then Johnson also served as military governor of Tennessee. Crucially, the radicals thought Johnson would be their champion. There's one really surreal and kind of nauseating scene where a senator from Ohio actually hopes Lincoln will be assassinated before the assassination because he thinks that Johnson will be tougher on the South. And Johnson's very tough talking, he says, treason must be made odious. And he's given up his slaves. And the first sign that there's problems is he shows up to the inauguration drunk and gives a really sloppy speech, which embarrasses Lincoln, who's a teetotaler. And then he's basically exiled. They basically don't talk for that final 6 weeks of his life until the last full day of Lincoln's life, where he describes what the cabinet's thinking in terms of, or we can surmise that they talk about what Lincoln about what the cabinet's plans are around Reconstruction, because bizarrely Johnson did not leave a record of that, nor was he seemed to have been asked when reporters were around. In any case, I think again it all comes down to character. The Atlantic does a profile of him during his presidency, where they describe him as being egotistic to the point of mental disease, vain and ill-tempered. He's incredibly susceptible to flattery. So where Lincoln makes it really clear, he wants a magnanimous peace, but he also wants to make sure that, while he wants to offer amnesty to the Confederate rank and file, he does not want the people who should have known better, right? The Confederate, former members of the U.S. Congress, the courts, the military, who defected to form the upper echelons of the Confederacy. He does not want them to gain back all their political power, political power and property at the outset. Which, by the way, still a pretty good deal compared to the traditional punishment for treason, which is hanging. But Johnson just can't wait to, he says, you got to come petition me directly. And he is so susceptible to flattery, he just basically gives it all away. And the black codes, I was stunned to find in my research that the black codes, which were, slavery without the chains in effect, started getting put in place in the late summer and fall of 1865. And I found one Confederate brigadier general who's functioning as governor of Mississippi, and he basically says, look, slavery's over. We got to accept it. We don't have to like it, but we don't have to accept equality. And so we should pass these laws. And Johnson acquiesces entirely. And one of the things the radicals misjudged, they thought he was a race warrior. He's a class warrior. He's driven by his resentment towards wealthy whites, when he is a poor white, and resentment towards the slaves who he felt created unequal competition. So that resentment defines him and is refracted through the lens of bigotry, and it gets worse and worse and worse. He refuses, in particular, to reauthorize the Freedmen's Bureau, which is a really important practical public-private partnership designed to help move ex-slaves towards self-sufficiency and deal with poor whites who are refugees in the wake of the South. He refuses. He vetoes the Civil Rights Act. In language that's very, similar to arguments we hear today, saying that we shouldn't have special rights for former slaves. And the partisan war, he becomes more erratic, more narcissistic, more reactionary as time goes on, gets involved in increasingly protracted fight with Republicans who almost impeach him. And it's just a disaster. He refused to attend the inauguration. But of his successor, General Grant. He pardons some people implicated in the Lincoln assassination on his final days in office. But if you just look at it as a portrait of character, a deformed character at a pivotal point in American history, it's a massive tragedy, and it's a cautionary tale about what happens when you have people with poor character in the presidency. And I must say, a lot of the details of his lousy character are very resonant and reminiscent of something we've experienced not so recently.
John, thank you. Michelle was good enough to put into chat a link to an article by our colleague Bill Costin on George Washington, and lo and behold, character.
Hold it.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, John. So listen, you all, we have 15 minutes and change. The floor is open. Use the raised hand function, press that button. When I don't see you, as often happens, Michelle will bring matters to my attention. Fritz, I think you would like in first round.
I was just posting a quote. I do have plenty of questions, but clearly my hand was not up first. Carolyn was first. So
Well,
Carolyn,
you're a gentleman and very courteous. Well, let's take Carolyn, and if you like, Fritz, we'll be right back to you. Carolyn, please.
Thank you, Fritz, and thank you, John, for being here with us. So my question for you is
And Carolyn and everybody, would you tell us who you are? And I will tell you that Carolyn is our managing editor.
yes, I'm as Jeff said, I'm the managing editor for American Purpose. So my question is, so you mentioned that Lincoln had this incredible sense of humor that he could kind of use it to smooth over tense spots. Now, I guess my question is, our modern political consumers, our modern audiences, we struggle with humor, and we are inclined, as you say, towards a feeling of moral superiority. I think probably on both sides of the aisle. How, even if we had someone who was a little more Lincoln-esque, do our political consumers need to change as well?
well, that's an interesting question and a complicated one. I do think you're right to point out that um, I know this is particularly true in digital media, right? That people need to keep in mind that they vote with their eyeballs and wallets every day. And so what they give attention to, you'll get more of. And in terms of the digital news ecosystem, if they gravitate towards celebrity scandals and car crashes, then they're going to get more celebrity scandals and car crashes. And when Ted Cruz checks his Twitter after he delivers what he thinks is a zinger on the Senate floor rather than paying attention to the hearing, you just kind of gave away the game, right? It's about conflict leading to attention, leading to donor dollars. And that's a feedback loop that we're all complicit in, but the algorithms make worse. So I will say that, while I'm not willing to absolve individuals of blame, the algorithms do make it worse. And one of the things I'm really evangelical about is the need for, is algorithm reform, because I do think that, the best object lesson you could get is how QAnon becomes quasi mainstream during COVID. I mean, dear God, if that's not a screaming example of and there are other studies as well. Facebook had an internal study called Carol, where it created a dummy account, which they had to shut down because within, days it was inundated with extremism and conspiratorial content. So I do think that humor of the right kind cuts through a lot of the formality. There's sort of a backwoods common sense that Lincoln communicates. It's an enormously effective tool, but I think a lot of our humor right now in politics is insult comedy, right? I mean, certainly, I think Trump is quite gifted as an insult comic. I do think that that Lincoln's humor, importantly, he gets into trouble early in his career where he's a good mimic. And as I say in the book, mimicry lives next door to mockery. And he deploys that in the Illinois state legislature. And he feels bad about it. He really hurts someone's feelings and causes a lot of problems for him. And so subsequently, he really does make himself the butt of his own jokes. It's self-deprecating. That's enormously appealing. It's enormously effective, particularly for politicians. So I think to the extent that, that humor can gently remind people of society's excesses, and it's going to be utterly unobjectionable when it's directed itself, that's good. It's disarming, and we could see and use a lot more of it. And I do think more leaders in the center need to lean into humor and storytelling. I think they're not enough, as Reagan would say, bold primary colors and too many pastel colors. I think that's a leadership issue from the broad center. I do think that people respond to tribes, and one of the contradictions, as I've said in group meetings like this, is that we are a tribe. We are a tribe trying to transcend tribalism, and that's complicated. On the other hand, that's also literally the story of America. And it's one of the reasons I've written books about Washington and Lincoln, is to show people there's a clear historic lineage that is not ideological or extremist in the least bit. And in fact, it's the opposite of it. And that one of the things about being American is that because we're the only nation founded on an idea, not a tribal identity, tribal politics short circuit us in unique and profound ways. So I think we do need to make a cause out of that. We also need effective leadership. And I think humor is one of the least utilized tools, especially from folks in the center, where if we accept and understand the negative stereotype of leaders from, moderates, it's split the difference, mushy middle, afraid to offend, and that's the exact opposite way of we should be. We should be decisive. We should be trying to focus on where there is considerable common ground and building on it, and lean into charisma, and humor is an important part of that. And Lincoln's examples, humor, scripture, and logic, are all tools he uses to depolarize debates, and I think we could learn from all of them.
So thank you both. Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks, John. I want to go, Fritz, if you want the floor, you have it now, and then after you, Ashish. Fritz?
Well, fair enough. I can't resist, especially if it's on Lincoln, who I admire tremendously. But the other one I admire tremendously from that time is Ulysses S. Grant. And I find it so interesting, both from the same region, let's say the Midwest, both with the same sort of an approach in so many different ways. And I'd be curious as to your thoughts, and if your book does discuss how Grant was viewing the conduct of the war with a goal towards eventual peace, and his obvious negotiations at Appomattox and so on, and Lincoln. Yes, the interaction between Lincoln and Grant. I'd be fascinated as to what you cover on that.
So I go into great detail about their relationship, because the bulk of the book is focused on the last 6 weeks of Lincoln's life. And as you get closer toward the end, I have time expand. So there's a great deal of focus spent on recreating the conversation captured in the painting The Peacemakers by G.P.A. Healy, which is in the White House, but which is based on notes from the participants shortly after Lincoln's assassination, Sherman, Grant, and Admiral Porter. And what you can tell from that conversation, and from accounts of the conversation between Lincoln and Grant on the porch of the house in Petersburg, Virginia, which, by the way, is for rent on Airbnb now, apparently, is that you can see that Grant's famously generous terms of surrender to Lee are basically him taking dictation in his mind from Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln had said in the days running up to this things like, let them go, let them have their horses to go home and plow with, and their guns to go home and shoot crows with. Give them the most liberal and honorable terms. We want them to return to obeying the laws of the United States. I mean, from specifics to sentiment, that's essentially what Grant does with Lee, and it makes a big difference early on. I also go into, in the afterlife of the idea, which is a sort of thing I tend to do towards the end of my books because it interests me. It also tends not to have been written. But the way the Grant presidency consciously tries to get us back on the Lincoln path after the disaster of Andrew Johnson. And I got to give enormous credit to Ron Chernow for, I think, giving the Grant presidency the honor it's due. I focus on one specific example in fairly granular detail, even maybe more so than Chernow did, on this aspect, which is Grant combating the KKK in partnership with his Southern Attorney General, Amos T. Ackerman. Is one of, I think, the forgotten heroes of American history. He's actually New Hampshire born, moves to the South initially for his health, but serves somewhat reluctantly, but nonetheless serves in the Confederate Army, combats Sherman, and then really becomes, as General Longstreet and later Mosby did, sort of evangelists for reuniting as a nation, giving the North and Republicans credit for a magnanimous peace. And he ends up participating. He's a Confederate veteran in the Grant cabinet, and he leads the prosecution of the Ku Klux Klan. And this is a problem that Lincoln had anticipated. He said, look, if we don't, one of the things the book gets into is the importance of stabilizing military gains, and that's part of how you win a peace. One of the things that Lincoln understood is that if you didn't do that, the vigilante groups would emerge very quickly. And the KKK does enormous damage, and it's one of the reasons why, when people are concerned about voter suppression, voter intimidation, and election subversion, we come by it honestly as a country. And if this group really wants to nerd out, you can look at the impacts of the 1870, 1872 redistricting in the South. But that's even nerdier than I get into in the book. But Amos T. Ackerman, the fact that he Grant goes to Congress, lobbies directly for the passage of the Enforcement Act, and then has it implemented and enforced by a Southern Attorney General and a Southern Solicitor General, So it makes it more difficult for them to say that's Yankee imperialism. And they also do what Lincoln would have done to the extent which they focused on the upper echelons of the KKK. And they were, those folks were sent to prison in Albany, New York for, a decade. But the rank and file got effectively amnesty if they turned. And it really did defang that first incarnation of the KKK. The KKK actually, it's not a continuous organization. It's the first incarnation in the 1860s and 70s. Then it comes back in the 1920s. And then it resurfaces again in the 1960s and 70s.
Well, as Grant's biggest fan, you've sold me on the book. So if you got one sale, I'm sure you're going to have.
There you go.
Hey, but I'm so impressed that you continued the story then after Lincoln's assassination. Thank you for helping correct this bias against Grant, which drives me crazy. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Fritz. Go now to Ashish, our research associate American Purpose and student at Columbia. You have that floor.
So to just kind of zoom out a bit, I was really, impressed at one of the points in your book where you mentioned Lincoln's thoughts about kind of American exceptionalism and kind of focusing that moral mission. You write how Lincoln said that I recollect thinking that something must have been more than just independence that they struggled for back in 1776 when they crossed the Delaware River. So I wanted to ask about this idea of America's role in this idea about a moral mission, about Lincoln's idea of reshaping the moral mission of America and how he almost viewed it as inevitable, how he almost viewed it as America's job. And he completely transcends this, local politics of the time to attribute, like you said, this idea of quote unquote American peace. So I was wondering kind of what you believe Lincoln's role was in reshaping the moral mission and moral fabric of America. How much credit do you think he deserves to an extent for America's subsequent history of, acting out Lincoln's quote about independence? Independence in the 1776 sense now means much more than just American independence. We largely tried to, and today I would argue still attempt to live up to that idea of a moral mission, that we are fighting for something for the whole world. I think this was a much less popular idea in Lincoln's time and something that was hard to defend, obviously with slavery. So what role do you think Lincoln plays in honestly reshaping himself?
Sure. And I appreciate the question. Thank you, Ashish. Look, I think that the second founding is enormously important as the Civil War era has been called, in that it can be, I think, a uniquely unifying rebirth of freedom and of the American story. And so I do think and anticipate that in the future, Lincoln and Grant and Frederick Douglass and others from that era will be at the center of our retelling of our own story. And I think, telling our story is enormously important for a nation founded on an idea, not a tribal identity. Lincoln as a leader, and it deserves enormous credit, I think, for doing what effective leaders do, particularly from moderate progressive perspective, not only though, which is tying change to the founding ideas and ideals. Right. So as Gary Wills wrote much better than I ever will in Lincoln at Gettysburg, he basically he takes the Declaration and reconnects the challenges of the time regarding slavery to fulfilling the ideals of the Declaration and bypasses some of the debate around the Constitution. Because we could address that with the amendments. And what he's very focused on, whether it's the Lyceum speech, where he famously says he's a nation of free men, we either live for all time or die by suicide, where the whole thing is a rumination on living up to the founder's vision and maintaining a democratic republic on a nation our scale, or in his debates with Stephen Douglas, where he points out is I hate slavery because it deprives us of our moral authority on the world stage, makes us look like hypocrites. And so part of what a reconciling leader does, if you look at the definition of reconciliation, takes a divided system and makes it whole and consistent. And I think, leaning into this idea of a more perfect union, right? That, perfection is not on the menu. We shouldn't hold ourselves to that standard past or present. But we do have a unique obligation to form a more perfect union and try to rededicate ourselves to the founding principles, while realizing that it's not, frozen in amber, that we have to meet the challenges of our time consistent with that founding vision. And that's what I think Lincoln does. If you look at all his great speeches, he's always connecting the past, the present, and the future. And if you look at, for example, Martin Luther King's speech on the Lincoln Memorial, not only does he harken back directly to Lincoln, who's over his shoulder, but he importantly says, this is about fulfilling a promissory note, not only from 100 years ago, but fulfilling the vision of the founders. All men are created equal. And so I think that general approach from a political leader is indispensable for reframing and recasting a lot of the debates that had gotten stuck in debates over the Constitution, the intention of the Constitutional Convention, whether slavery is a matter of constitutional liberty, which seems absurd in his face, but was widely accepted, and some people still echo it today. So I think Lincoln's power as a leader was very much about reframing and refocusing that national debate. But the war was also, I think, helped, unfortunately, dislodge a lot of the divisions that were in the place. I don't think war is necessary to redo that as a nation, but I think everything can be learned about the way that Lincoln approached it by directly connecting the change he was trying to achieve and saying, this is actually a better fulfillment of the founders' vision. This shows more fidelity to the founders than simply sticking with the status quo.
So thank you. I'm looking at the clock. We have 2 minutes to go. I'm going to permit myself a concluding observation. Thank John. Thank you all. John, I think so many people today in the United States misunderstand the very proposition of leadership. And it's not uncommon to hear from folks, well, I'm not a leader because I'm not a politician. But of course, leadership is desired and urgently needed in media, in industry and business, in education, in journalism. And I want to compliment you because the book you've written, the subject you've tackled, the way you explain is compelling, but it's a sign of leadership. And it's very valuable and very important to all of us. Please, you all read, if you haven't done so already, the book Lincoln, the Fight for Peace, 2022, Simon & Schuster. Keep watching and listening and reading and following John. I'm always obliged to say, please ditto American Purpose. If you're not a member, become a member. Share with family and friends. Halloween and Thanksgiving are coming. It's such a marvelous gift. Thank you all for a valuable time. It's a great group. What a cast of 20, 22 people this last 5 minutes. And John, you're such a pleasure and joy. Godspeed. Thank you for spending this time with us.
Well, thank you for all you guys do. The American Purpose is doing really important work. So it's a pleasure to talk with you all.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody.